So we're in the middle of chapter 40. Brandon held the canteen out to Kenneth and he sighed. Fine, but this is the last time I'm taking this. I don't care if I have to freeze to death out here. Before Brandon could argue against this course of action, he grabbed the canteen, took a shot of it, then drank down the rest of his water to wash it down. I'll have to refill it at the river, he thought, and handed the canteen back to Brandon. As they continued their walk, they finally neared the top of the hill they'd been climbing. When they reached the top, they had a good view of the landscape ahead. A narrow river started at the base of the hill, and by the look of things, the river was flowing downstream towards them. Flat sheets of ice lay on top of the river all over its narrow surface. They floated down the river at a leisurely pace. Out in the distance, on either side of the river, steep cliffs rose so high that their peaks reached into the clouds. Through the river definitely seemed like their best option, though the thought of man-eating fish sent a chill down Kenneth's spine as he surveyed the waters of the river. The crew followed the river upstream until at last the cliff face stood in their way. They now had no other choice but to ice hop their way upstream until they cleared the long cliff staring down at them on either side. Kenneth noticed that due to the height of the cliffs, a very limited amount of sunlight was allowed into the ravine, but it was still obvious enough where the ice ended and where the waters began. The water was much darker than the ice, even in the dim lighting allowed between the two cliffs. Once they all refilled their bottles of the cold water, they knew what had to be done next, so one by one, they hopped onto a floating piece of ice and proceeded forwards, one iceberg at a time. Chapter 41. Brandon rests near the water. The narrow river stretched out before them as the crew hopped from ice block to ice block. The ice was thick enough to keep above water at all times, but regardless they hopped lightly, not putting any more weight on them than necessary. More than once or twice, Kenneth thought he saw creatures darting through the water, not too far below the surface. It was usually just before a jump. When he looked behind him on the next block, the dark figure was gone. He began to wonder if he was losing it from paranoid fear of sharp-toothed fish. The group were beginning to tire from all the long jumps, so they found an area to rest at the base of the left cliff, where the cliff got really flat before inclining steeply a couple meters in. Brandon went to a corner near the water and plopped to the ground, exhausted from the journey so far. His back lay against a rock and his legs spread out, so his feet were just over the water. The rest of them stayed on the opposite corner of the rock, wanting to let him rest in peace. Whoa, we're like halfway through the ravine and still haven't come across any sharp-toothed gill thingies in the water. This is going great, Cleo commented. Kenneth had a bad feeling that their luck wouldn't hold up for the last half of the river and the cliffs. He'd wanted to believe the dark forms in the water had been in his imagination, but he refused to dismiss the terrible feeling in his gut. Just remember to keep your glove ready. You see something move, you do what you have to stop it from getting to us. Got it? Kenneth asked. I understand, but now that I think about it, what are even the chances of these waters being habitable by aquatic creatures? Once the water reaches below 0 Celsius, it's uninhabitable by most species of fish. What are the odds of dangerous ones being in this river? Honestly, Cleo asked. The same odds of a snowstorm being capable of burying a person under a mile of ice, Kenneth thought, but kept his mouth shut. Don't put your guard down for a second, Cleo. Kenneth's saying these things for a reason. It's like on Jagged Rock Isle. Kenneth saw evidence of a threat against us, and did everything he could to warn us about that threat. Now we've just seen evidence of another threat, and I'll be damned if I'm gonna be as careless as I was back then, Rachel said. Kenneth was glad to see Rachel actually agreed with him, even when Cleo didn't necessarily. Yeah, that's a good point, Rachel. Don't worry. I'll keep a darn close eye on the waters, at least until we get out of here, Cleo said, pulling her glove up to emphasize her point. Cleo turned her head and saw Brandon resting near the river, his back against a rock and his eyes shut. Cleo suddenly wondered why they let Brandon rest so close to the waters that were supposedly infested with sharp-toothed chompfish. She turned her head back, facing her friends. Guys, we should tell Brandon about those fish, and tell the fool not to stay so darn close to the water, Cleo suggested, and when they all nodded their agreement, they got up and started towards Brandon. But by then it was too late. They turned just in time to see Brandon's hand sink under the water as a piranha fish dragged him under. Chapter 42, Piranhas for Dinner. Pulling out his magnum, Kenneth rushed to the side and pointed the gun at the water. He tried to get a look at Brandon and hopefully catch sight of the fish that was dragging him under, but he didn't see either and got ready to dive in after Brandon. Wait, he's coming back up, Cleo said, pointing at the figure desperately swimming up towards the surface. Kenneth regained his balance on the edge of the cliff and saw she was right. It eventually became clear Brandon had escaped the aquatic captor dragging him down by the boot. The fish was after him, red eyes menacing in the dark water, and by the time Brandon surfaced and climbed onto the ledge, the water was full of red dots, getting closer and closer. Brandon gasped for air as Kenneth and Cleo dragged him as far away from the ledge as possible. He was breathing heavily, but he didn't appear to have gotten any water in his lungs. However, he was shivering from the cold and his clothes were wet and soaked. Brandon, can you walk? We need to get out of here. There have to be hundreds of fish down there, all of which seem intent on eating us for afternoon tea, Kenneth yelled. When Brandon's breathing finally slowed, he stood up shakily. Then let's go, he said, and ran to the edge of the low cliff. They had just made it off the ledge before dozens of piranha killers had leaped out of the water after them. From that point onwards, it was a race to the finish line. The cliffs eventually began to decrease in size on either side, and soon they'd have somewhere to jump to get away from the horde of biters swarming after them from behind. Taking the rear, Kenneth tried to keep up with the others, but there were too many piranhas getting too close. On occasion, he'd have to risk turning back and attempting to shoot the advancing figures in the water, but whenever he got the shot, another one would simply take the place of its brethren. He was going through much of his ammo supplies, but he had to. This was life or death. He decided to stop running It was making his aim shaky, which meant his accuracy left something to be desired, which meant bullets not finding their targets. Staying still and focusing, it helped a great deal with his aim. He was picking off the fish one by one, and the bodies were really beginning to pile up. Pretty soon Kenneth began to see a bunch of the piranhas turn around and swim away. Wussies, Kenneth thought, then began to turn forwards and run. He felt something hard clench against his boot, and a second later he fell over and hit his head against the ice. The thing clenching its jaw on Kenneth's boot began to pull back, and Kenneth's hands scrambled for something to keep him on top of the ice block he was on. There was nothing on it, just flat ice, and he began to slide off the ice until his face was almost submerged in the water. But suddenly the fish stopped pulling on his boot, and at the same time someone grabbed his hand and pulled him back on top of the ice. It was Cleo, and she had a sword sheathed at her side. She'd killed the piranha fish and saved him, thank God. Sitting Kenneth up, she wrapped Kenneth in an embrace and held him tight. And after a moment of hesitation, he embraced her as well. Pulling back from the embrace, she gave Kenneth a slap, pretty hard. Don't ever scare me like that. I almost didn't make it in time to save you, Cleo said sorrowfully, then leaned her head forwards and sobbed into his chest. Stroking her hair, he said, I'm sorry, but look behind us. I took out a decent amount of fish back there, scared off the rest of them. You should be grateful. She pulled away and looked at him. I am. I'm also grateful we're going to eat all right tonight, she said. It took Kenneth a moment to realize she was talking about the dead fish bodies, slowly drifting down the river away from them. Chapter 43. Brandon gets angry. After wrapping up a couple of fish in some cling wrap and stowing them away in their backpack, Kenneth and Cleo continued up the river until they were past the cliffs. Brandon and Rachel were on the right side of the river waving at them, so they hopped off the ice block and joined them. Brandon looked up at the sky. The sun was now low in the western horizon, which meant they'd lose sunlight before long, especially with Mount Frost in its way. Nevertheless, they all agreed to camp out in the nearest cavern to recover from the ordeal they'd just been through, so the next one they found they went inside it and set up a fire. Kenneth found each of them a stick. After gutting the fish, he stuck out one for each of them on the sticks he'd found, and gave them it before sitting next to them around the fire. Kenneth spoke once they were done eating. So what do you think we're gonna deal with next? Any ideas? Unfortunately, Brandon didn't seem to have any answers for that question. He seemed just as uncertain as the rest of them. Wait, let me get something straight. You guys knew there were piranha fish in the waters back there, and you didn't tell me? Brandon asked, and each of them hung their heads down to avoid the question. But that was all the evidence Brandon needed. I cannot believe you would withhold that from me. I thought we were a team, honestly, but you somehow don't think I could have helped defend us against them, Brandon yelled, making Cleo flinch. She spoke. It's not that we didn't think you could have helped us. Then what was it? I could have died back there, so there'd better be a damn good reason why you brats didn't tell me a goddamn thing, Brandon yelled. Brandon, we're sorry. We screwed up, okay? But that doesn't give you the right to talk to us like this, Cleo began. But Brandon stood up and slapped Cleo across the face, making her fall back from the log she'd been seated on. Kenneth rushed forwards to punch Brandon in the face, but Rachel quickly got in his way. Move, Kenneth demanded. I'm gonna kick this guy's ass. Kenneth, please calm down. I don't know what's gotten into Brandon, but we can't afford to squabble amongst ourselves. Just give Brandon a minute to recover from this, please, Rachel implored. Even through the rage at what Brandon had just done to Cleo, he could see the reason behind Rachel's words, and took a deep breath to calm himself. Fine, we'll give Brandon a moment to clear his head. Come on, let's go deeper into the cave, Kenneth said. And once he made sure Cleo was okay, the three of them proceeded deeper into the cave and away from the enraged man behind them. Chapter 44. Brandon doesn't apologize. Kenneth, Cleo, and Rachel now sat around a campfire deeper within the cavern. Cleo had pretended that the slap Brandon had given her didn't hurt that bad, but Kenneth saw the way she winced when she placed her hand on her cheek. I'm so sorry I let this happen to you, Cleo. I should have known the grumpy old jerk would pull something like that, Kenneth said. No, it's not your fault. We made a mistake not telling Brandon about those piranhas, and we have to face the consequences, Cleo said. You getting slapped shouldn't be a consequence under any circumstances. Brandon clearly isn't thinking straight right now. Hopefully we can get through this and move on soon, Kenneth said. Eventually they heard footsteps coming from the right and turned their heads to see Brandon, who stopped when they saw him. Hey, can I take a seat? Brandon asked them. Kenneth stood up. You're not sitting next to anyone until you apologize to Cleo. Do it now, he demanded. I'll apologize when I want to, so I'll ask again, can I take a seat? Brandon asked. Cleo reached up and put a hand on Kenneth's shoulder. Kenneth, just stop it. We need to start thinking about the road ahead of us. It's getting dark and we need to plan for possible dangers, Cleo said. Kenneth hadn't liked the way Brandon had brushed aside his demand, but Brandon ended up taking a seat anyway. So like I said, I'm not certain about the dangers ahead of us. However, I recommend we use the darkness to our advantage. There's no telling what could lay in wait for us this deep in the Frostlands, Brandon said. Well, if that's all, we should really be on our way. Lord Blazer's revival is in 4 days after all. We don't have a moment to lose, Cleo said, then got up to leave, but Kenneth held a hand out in front of her. But first, Brandon, tell Cleo you're sorry now, Kenneth said heatedly. How about you apologize for almost getting me killed? Or is that small fact overshadowed by the fact that I laid a hand on your poor picked-on little girlfriend? Brandon asked angrily. Fine, don't apologize. Just don't expect me to talk to you until you do, Kenneth said, then stormed out of the cavern.